Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt that something was off? Nobody was arguing. Nobody seemed upset. On the surface, everything looked completely normal, and yet somehow you could feel a tension hanging in the air, something invisible, something no one was talking about. Then hours later, or maybe days later, the truth came out. Someone was actually upset. A relationship was quietly falling apart. A problem had been there all along, and somehow you sensed it long before anyone said a word. If that sounds familiar, there's a good chance you're the kind of person who notices things other people miss. Small shifts in someone's tone, a pause that lasts just a little too long, a look that flashes across a person's face for less than a second. For most of their lives, people like this are often given the same labels. You overthink. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. But what if that's not the whole story? Because psychology paints a very different picture. The ability to notice what others overlook isn't always a sign of anxiety, and it isn't always a weakness. Sometimes it's the result of a mind that learned to pay closer attention to the world than most people ever do. And once you understand why that happens, you may start seeing yourself in a completely different light. The first thing to understand is this. You're not actually seeing things that nobody else can see. You're simply noticing signals that most people never pay attention to. Someone walks into a room wearing their usual smile. Everyone assumes they're fine, but you notice the smile lingers a little too long. Their words sound normal, yet something about their energy feels different. That's because the human brain is constantly taking in an enormous amount of social information every second. Most of it gets filtered out before it ever reaches conscious awareness. But for some people, that filter seems a little less strict. They pick up on subtle shifts in facial expressions, changes in tone, tiny inconsistencies in behavior, not because they're trying to, not because they're actively analyzing every moment, but because their minds have become so accustomed to observing the world that they're doing it even when they don't realize it. And that's where this story really begins. But why do some people seem to scan their environment all the time? The answer begins with anxiety. When the brain learns that the world can become unpredictable at any moment, it starts operating like a radar system. Always searching, always checking, always looking for what might happen next. It doesn't just listen to what's being said. It listens for what's not being said. It doesn't just watch people's actions, it tries to predict what's coming before it happens. And in situations where there is real danger, that ability can be incredibly useful. The problem is that the radar doesn't always know when to switch off. So even in moments of peace, even when nothing is wrong, part of your mind is still searching, still scanning, still preparing for a threat that may never come. And over time, that constant vigilance becomes exhausting. But anxiety is only part of the story. To understand the rest, we have to go much further back to childhood. Researchers studying attachment and emotional development have noticed something interesting. Children who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments often develop an unusual skill. They learn how to read people long before most others do, not because they're naturally curious, but because they have to. When the mood of the adults around you can change without warning, paying attention becomes a survival strategy. A look, a sigh, a slight change in someone's voice. Small signals suddenly become important. Maybe you were the child who could tell what kind of day it was going to be the moment someone walked through the door. Maybe you learned to stay quiet when the atmosphere felt tense. Maybe you became incredibly good at sensing emotions that were never spoken out loud. Over time, your brain starts making a connection. Safety depends on prediction. If you can see what's coming, you can protect yourself. So, the mind adapts. It becomes more alert, more observant, more sensitive to subtle changes in the environment. And then something strange happens. The child grows up. The environment changes, the danger may no longer be there, but the system remains. It follows you into friendships, into relationships, into workplaces, into ordinary conversations, like a storm warning system that keeps running long after the storm has passed. That's why so many people feel like they can read a room the moment they walk into it. Not because they possess some mysterious gift, but because their brains spent years practicing a skill that once helped them feel safe in an unpredictable world. And here's the part most people never realize. What others call being too sensitive is sometimes evidence of a nervous system that learned to pay attention far more carefully than it ever should have needed to. What's fascinating is that the very system that was built to protect you can also become one of your greatest strengths. People like this often notice emotional shifts before they're ever spoken out loud. They can sense tension in a room, pick up on changes in relationships, recognize when someone is struggling, even when that person insists they're fine. To others, it can look like intuition, almost as if they have some kind of sixth sense. But in many cases, what's really happening is much simpler. Their brains are processing countless tiny signals that most people either miss or ignore. A subtle change in posture, a hesitation before answering, a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Individually, these signals don't mean much, but together they create a picture. And people who have spent years paying attention often learn how to see that picture long before everyone else does. The gift isn't magic, it's awareness. And sometimes awareness can feel almost supernatural to those who don't experience it themselves. But seeing more comes with a price that very few people talk about. Because when you notice things that others miss, you also notice things they get to ignore. A flicker of disappointment in someone's eyes, a growing distance in a relationship, a subtle shift in the way someone talks to you. Things that seem insignificant to everyone else can stay with you for hours, sometimes days. While other people move on, part of your mind is still putting the pieces together. You replay conversations, you analyze small details, you wonder whether you missed something, or whether what you noticed means more than you're willing to admit. And that's why many highly observant people end up trapped in cycles of rumination. They don't just experience life, they examine it, constantly. A 5-minute conversation can turn into an hour of thinking. A brief glance can become the subject of an entire evening's reflection. What exhausts them isn't weakness. It's the sheer amount of information they're carrying. Imagine living in a world with the brightness turned all the way up. Everything becomes clearer, but everything also becomes harder to ignore. That's what heightened awareness often feels like. You see more, you understand more, but you also absorb more. And sometimes the thing you need most isn't better observation. It's permission to stop observing for a while. And this brings us to what may be the most important part of all. The biggest mistake people like this make is assuming they can no longer trust themselves. After years of hearing things like, "You're overthinking," "You're reading too much into it," "You're imagining things," many begin to question their own perceptions. They stop trusting what they notice. They start second-guessing every instinct. But maturity isn't about shutting off your awareness. It's not about becoming less observant. It's about learning something far more valuable. Learning the difference between observation and interpretation. Because those are not the same thing. Observation is noticing that someone's tone changed. Interpretation is immediately assuming they must be angry with you. Observation is seeing distance. Interpretation is believing the relationship is falling apart. And this is where anxiety quietly slips into the picture. It takes real information and starts telling a story around it. A story that isn't always true. The goal isn't to ignore your instincts, and it isn't to blindly trust them either. The goal is to pause, to separate the signal from the fear, to ask yourself, What did I actually notice? And what part of this am I adding myself? Because the line between intuition and anxiety is often much thinner than people realize. And learning to tell the difference may be one of the most powerful skills you ever develop. One last thing. If you're someone who notices things other people don't, that doesn't mean you're always right, but it doesn't mean you're imagining things either. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Maybe your mind is simply picking up on more information than most people realize. More subtle cues, more emotional signals, more of the things that often go unnoticed. And while that can sometimes feel like a burden, it can also be a gift that becomes much easier to carry once you understand where it comes from. Because understanding these patterns is one thing. Actually changing your relationship with them is something else entirely. Awareness alone doesn't rewire years of conditioning. That takes practice. It takes patience. And most importantly, it takes self-compassion. So the next time your intuition speaks up, don't rush to believe it, but don't rush to dismiss it either. Get curious. Pay attention. Observe before you judge. Over time, you'll begin to recognize the difference between genuine insight and anxious prediction, and that difference changes everything. I'm curious, which part of this video resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to read your thoughts. And if this video helped you understand yourself a little better, consider subscribing for more psychology insights like this. Until then, be gentle with yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.